This is Dayton's Bluff, and behind me you can see the entrance to Carver's Cave. I've been coming down to Carver's Cave since 1988 and documenting the changes that have occurred, and the landscape around here, especially since Bruce Vento Nature Sanctuary is formed, is changed very greatly. When I first came down here, this place was covered with buckthorns, and the entire area that you see out here where this pond is now, this nicely landscaped pond, there were just mounds of rubble. The railroad, what they used to do is whenever some debris would fall down off the cliffs, they would come along and scoop it up and dump it out here in front of the cave. So if we were standing here back in 1988, you would not even have been able to see the cave. And it was just buried behind these mounds of debris. As it is today, you can see that it has a very engineered sort of entrance. The cave has a natural tendency to want to close itself. Debris from the bluff above will fall down occasionally and block the entrance, and people will come along every once in a while and dig it back out. And they installed these steel doors in 1977 when the cave was last dug out, and thinking to keep people out. But the soft St. Peter sandstone bedrock in which the cave is formed is so easily eroded that people would just dig past those doors and enter the cave. And in fact, that's how I used to get into the cave. And I'd go exploring and put on a wetsuit and go back in there and go back into total darkness in deep water in the back end of the cave, and just go exploring around there. And it's kind of hard to believe looking at it now that that's the way it is inside the cave, where the old lake that Jonathan Carver described when he visited Carver's Cave in 1766. That lake is still in there, and it's the water in there is just as deep and cold, spring-fed water. From who knows what source, and the water is so cold that you need a wetsuit to insulate yourself from that water. The cave itself was probably formed during or shortly after the ice ages. The meltwater from the receding ice sheets, as it poured southwards, it carved the Mississippi River Gorge where we're standing, and in carving this deep gorge, it exposed this very soft layer of St. Peter sandstone, this very whitish, sugary kind of sand. And in so doing, in exposing this sandstone, there was a lot of water that was pent up, a lot of groundwater that was pent up in that sandstone that wanted to get out, so to speak. And once the gorge was carved, this water could then flow to the side and carved natural caves, one of which is Carver's Cave, but there are others less well known in the Twin Cities that were formed by this same process. For example, Fountain Cave and Channel Rock Caverns in Minneapolis were all formed by this process of water, groundwater washing away sand grains and creating these spaces. This is very different from the way most of the caves in Minnesota and elsewhere formed. Most natural caves form by a process of chemical solution, where the groundwater actually corrodes or eats away the very body of the limestone, whereas here it was merely washing away sand grains. The cave itself, as I mentioned, was first described by Jonathan Carver, a British colonial, when he came here in 1766 and 1767. But the cave had obviously had a long history, or prehistory, shall we say, before that, because the natives, even at that time, had traditions about this cave. They called it the Walken Teepee, the House of the Great Spirit. And they had a tradition about it, that when you go in there and you'd hold a torch in there, you know, there were these kind of like shimmerings on the water. The mounds that were the burial mound, Indian burial mounds that were built on Dayton's Bluff behind me, are connected with this cave in the sense that this is thought to be one of the entrances. The cave itself is thought to be one of the entrances to the underworld. So it's all sort of connected in that way. So they told him about Carver's, you know, what subsequently became, he never called it Carver's Cave. That was a later invention of a later generation. Jonathan Carver himself always called it Walkin' Teepee, as the Native Americans did. So he described the cave and going in there and what it was like, and he describes the petroglyphs at the entrance. Now this is significant because there is only one petroglyph left in the cave, and this petroglyph was noted by the historian Alan Woolworth when he was here when the cave was reopened in 1977. But he's a little secretive about where that petroglyph is, and it could in fact be below the present water line of the cave, because once the cave was opened in 1977, it has since the lake reformed after that, and so it probably it could be well below the water line or beneath the debris cone that formed from debris from the bluffs above since 1977. But so Jonathan Carver mentions the petroglyphs at the entrance, and most of the petroglyphs were destroyed in the 1800s when the railroads came through here. The Bruce Vento Nature Sanctuary itself is sort of carved out of an old railroad yard, where there had been railroad tracks that have since been removed. And Carver's Cave itself in the 1800s was used as a watering tank for the old steam engines. And of course, our modern day diesel engines don't need that, but so they'd come here and they could load up on water and so on, just draw it right out of the cave. So the cave was you know, thoroughly commercialized in a sense at that time. But so the cave was visited. Carver's Cave was visited by pretty much anyone and everyone who came up the Mississippi River in the early 1800s. It was a picnicking spot. You know, all the famous explorers who came through here. You know, for example, Long and Nicollet, they all talk about their experiences here at Carver's Cave. And when the city of St. Paul then was founded in the 1840s, of course, you know, it really took off. In the 1860s, there was actually a boat inside the cave, and there was just a rowboat left in there for anyone to use. You want to go exploring around in there, you know, take a romantic subterranean boat voyage with your sweetheart on a pleasant summer day. You could do that, it was only when the railroads got way up to it that it became completely useless as a picnic spot. And you just basically had no access to it. In fact, when I first came down here in 1988, I think technically it was probably illegal. There's probably railroad land back at that time, and I had to kind of scooch down the bluffs and kind of mind my own business and hide behind the little mounds of debris and so on as I made my way to the cave, because it's not really certain who owned it at that time. Was it the city parks or the railroads? And now it is part of the park system. And I'm very, one of the things that has pleased me is that in all the years since I've known Carver's Cave, finally it's out where people can, you know, where it can be enjoyed, and people there's a public access to it, and it's no longer illegal to come down to certainly one of the most famous natural features in Minnesota, and according to some of the old chroniclers, in North America back in the 1800s. And that's a pretty remarkable statement, considering you got Niagara Falls and the Mammoth Cave of Kentucky. But some have described it as, you know, have given it that sort of cachet. Well, anyway, about 100 years after Jonathan Carver visited this cave, it acquired the name Jonathan Carver's Cave, and the Minnesota Historical Society held a centennial down here, a Carver Centenary as they called it, and that was in 1867. And they came down here, and there was a big to-do, and Robert Sweeney, local artist, drew pictures of people exploring around in the cave at that time. And they speculated about what it would be like to be at the Carver's Cave bicentenary in 1967. Well, little did they realize the sad fate of Carver's Cave at that time. It fell into eclipse after that, and all the debris coming down off the bluffs soon sealed it, and it was lost for a generation. And it wasn't until 1913 that an energetic local businessman by the name of John Caldwell came down here and determined that he would open it up again. And just as a sort of a Dayton's Bluff neighborhood kind of revitalization project or something like that. And so he hired a team of men. They came down here with horses, and they dug for quite some time. And they were finally, about this time of year, it was in November of 1913, that they were able to open the cave again. And unfortunately, at that time, tragedy struck again, because the joy in reopening this cave was tempered by, as happens so many times in human affairs, other people get jealous, and Caldwell had a rival in town and decided he was the real explorer of this cave. And he went toe-to-toe with Caldwell, and it generated a flurry of newspaper clippings. So the 1913 reopening of Carver's Cave is by far the most well documented, because there is so much, there was, as some people called it, a war going on between the Caldwell people and the Armstrong people, as the Armstrong being the Ramsey County surveyor, who claimed that he was the true discoverer or rediscoverer of the cave, and not Caldwell. Any Native American claims at that point had been completely swept under the rug. And so there was even one point when it became so nasty in the early days of 1914, when one of the others threatened to actually blow the cave up with dynamite. So this was getting really nasty. And the police got involved, and finally everyone got everyone to lay off and stop this silly feud. And then finally in the 1920s, Caldwell wrote up a reminiscence of the whole of his involvement with Carver's Cave. And he made a mysterious statement at the time. He said that Carver's Cave has never been truly explored. And I thought that was so strange, because I had been in Carver's Cave, and I thought I had come to the end of it. And it wasn't until I was really studying some of the maps of that time, especially the Burnley map, which had been drawn in 1913 at the time of this reopening, I realized that they were claiming that there were more rooms in the back end of the cave. And that's really how my involvement as a cave explorer came about. As I mentioned, I first came down here in 1988, and I'm trying to come down here at least every few months since then, just to sort of photograph and document the changes at the cave. But what really intrigued me is this idea that Caldwell's idea that this cave had not been well and truly explored at the time, and that there were these hidden rooms back there. And when I went to the back of the end of the cave, and with that in mind, it is true. When you get back there, it does sound the way the water is kind of slapping against the ceiling back there and so on. It does kind of impress you that it kind of sounds like there might be a room back there, that you're kind of like trapping an air bubble back there, and the water is like slapping in a distant room. Or maybe it's just the auditory effects, I'm not sure. But I got involved And I made extensive efforts in the early 90s to try to drain the lake down a little bit inside Carver's Cave. And I just kind of dug down at the entrance and kind of let some of the water out. But I'm afraid the Walking Teepee had the last laugh, because no matter how many times you would dig this cave down, you came back and it seemed like the water level was higher than when you started. And of course, what's happening, all this debris dams back the water. And at one point, after a very large release of water, I came within a year, it was like the highest water level I'd ever seen it in the cave. It was almost darn near up to the ceiling. And so when I would I went into Carver's Cave at that time in a wetsuit, again, because the water is very cold, up like 48 degrees. You get in the back end of the cave, the water level was so high back there that you'd have about this much, here's the water and here's the cave ceiling, and at some point you have to kind of turn your head like this and try to keep your head above the surface of the water in the back end of the cave. And at the same time when you're doing this, the tips of your toes are not even touching on the floor of the cave. So the water back there is really deep. You're just floating by virtue of wearing that wetsuit. But it's, and I imagine that the way they've done up the cave now really blocked it up well, that the cave lake in there is probably deeper than it's ever been. And it's probably, again, almost up to the ceiling in there. So the lake that Jonathan Carver first described in there still exists, but it's like the water in there is much deeper than, because when Jonathan Carver came around here, this area, this land here, I think all this land you see here is basically fill in here. Where this pond is, all this was filled in by the railroad so that they could, put their tracks in here. And when Jonathan Carver came here in the 1700s, I think the land surface here was probably about a dozen feet lower. And so you can imagine coming up to this cave, it would be something that you would look up toward. You would look up toward, going in this nice arch that Jonathan Carver describes. Whereas now when you get there, you're kind of like, you're actually looking down with it. The land surface has come up so much, you're actually like looking down towards the cave. Recently, I guess this past summer, the city park officials came in here and did a very hard engineering job and have really, they welded some more steel plate on the entrance and poured some concrete. And the only idea, if somebody didn't tell you there was a cave there, you wouldn't know it. You'd think they're just bracing up part of the cliff or something. But the only way you know that this Carver's Cave is there is basically you got a little bit of water trickling out on the lower left-hand side as you face the entrance. A little bit of that, because that lake water is constantly coming in the back end of that lake, and then it's constantly draining out the front entrance. And that's also the reason why it's so hard to drain the lake inside the cave, because as soon as you remove some water, just more can just come right back in from the back end. Another thing they did is they installed this 6-inch in diameter PVC plastic pipe going down at an angle in there. And I was curious about if anyone, I should know what that would be for. Because I've studied Carver's Cave so thoroughly, but I didn't know. And I asked somebody, and they said that was for the bats to go in. And I'm kind of bemused by that statement, because I've never seen any bats I've seen everything from minnows to beavers inside Carver's Cave over the years, but never any bats. The ceiling is just too smooth to hang on to. But it was a nice thought, but they would leave this little tube there so bats could fly up it and down. But predictably, it's just become a little trash receptacle. People can throw it, and it's already sealed up. Initially, I thought that plastic tube was for the lake to drain out, because that water inside, once they dam it so thoroughly, it is going to get up to the ceiling. I thought, well, maybe they don't want the exit to wash away, so they'll have like a little relief valve there. Well, no, but it's for the bats, they claim. So that's an interesting thing. But if you look above the cave, you can see the source of you have the cave itself, but then on the cliffs above, it's just vaguely kind of funnel shaped up there. And this very subtle landscape feature is actually very important, because this is what is the funnel for debris to come down from the cliffs above. And if you look at the trees up on Dayton's Bluff there at the top, you'll see some of those old trees at the top there are practically just hanging on by their fingernails, not to mix metaphors. But they're going to come down pretty soon. But what it does is it gives you an idea of just the sort of cliff recession that's been going on. That this cliff actually was much further out at one time. And so where is all the debris that used to make up the land surface where those trees originally grew? Well, all that stuff, all that debris has been funneled down in front of Carver's Cave. And that's why the main theme in the post-European history of Carver's Cave has been this sort of generational cycle that the cave naturally seals itself with debris from the cliffs above. Once every 30 years, some enterprising individual, for whatever his motivation, usually it's some sort of anniversary, a bicentennial, the centennial of the state, the centennial of this discovery of the cave, whatever it is, somebody will come down here and try to dig the cave open again with greater or less success. And then after the hoopla, they go back, they leave the cave, and it goes back to the way it was and naturally seals itself again. And then at that point, the only way you can tell that there was a cave there, once the cave is completely debris covered, is that you're going to have that spring water trickling out, and you probably see some cattails here and so on. There's another cave that is very similar to Carver's Cave. In fact, it's Carver Cave's lesser twin. It's called Dayton's Cave, named after Dayton's Bluff, after Lyman Dayton, the early St. Paul settler. And this cave is located just 400 feet upriver from Carver's Cave. And that one is completely buried. But I know where it is because there's cattails growing at the base of the bluff. That's where the water's coming out. Because Dayton's Cave, just like Carver's Cave, has a lake in it. And this water's got to drain out. This cold groundwater's got to drain out somehow. And so, it drains out through the debris pile, and you have the water crest, the sort of hydric vegetation that tends to favor those kinds of locations. Carver's Cave had this tendency to get the entrance to the cave there was a tendency for the entrance to Carver's Cave to be buried by debris from the cliffs above over time, and then about once every generation someone would come along and dig it out. And in 1977, as a national bicentennial project, remember the Carver bicentenary had already come and gone in 1967. But as a sort of belated national bicentennial project, in 1977, the St. Paul City Parks Department decided to reopen Carver's Cave. And they brought a front end loader, and the archaeologist Ellen Woolworth was down here, and some Native Americans, and they dug the entrance to the cave open. And then afterwards they decided, well, we don't want to just leave this cave wide open like this. And so what they did is they came in and installed these steel doors over the entrance. And with some degree of success, as you can see, the very soft St. Peter sandstone itself, which is, just crumbles away like sugar, this sandstone soon wore away, and you can already see there's a substantial gap between where this steel door is and the actual face of the sandstone here. I mean, it's worn back that much since 1977, just from natural causes and from people rubbing against it and carving their names, and see all kinds of graffiti in here. and so on. And so as soon as they installed those doors, then the cave began, the debris began falling again from the cliffs. It came pouring over the top, and had soon buried these doors. I remember when I came here in 1988, the level of sand, it was up to about here. And then, as the millennium approached, the year 2000, the sand level was getting way up to the top near here. And when I spent Y2K in this cave, there was a lot of millennial predictions about what would happen at the, when the great, when the turn of the century there, as some interpret it to be, and the sort of calamities that might happen. And I thought that just as an interesting joke that I would spend the night in Carver's Cave, and that's what I did. I came down here and I went inside the cave, and midnight came and went, and nothing happened. But anyway, that's just merely an aside. But at that time, at the millennium, the sand level was up to about here. And then shortly thereafter, they began the landscaping for the Bruce Vento Nature Sanctuary, and they carved out this immense pool here, very nicely done, and they removed all the sand here. So now you kind of see it up to this point, a lot of the door exposed. One thing you don't realize, though, is when you look at the face of the sandstone, that the cave has changed, that the entrance area has changed substantially since it was seen by the early explorers. If you look back at some of the earliest photographs of Carver's Cave at the Historical Society and so on, what you will see is that this entire area has been filled in since then.
Start from that section again after this plane goes. Just start again with if you look at some of those early photographs.
Okay. Okay, sure.
Okay.
If you look at some of the early photographs of Carver's Cave at the Historical Society, the entrance had a very different appearance back in the 1800s. I mean, this area has been substantially filled in by the railroads. Back then, and I imagine even earlier when Jonathan Carver discovered the cave, or he was shown the cave rather, that this land surface here was about a dozen feet lower. So when you look at some of these early photographs, this here is what is called a bedding plane in the St. Peter sandstone. And this line is very useful in studying the cave because you can see it in the old photographs. And this line here would have been in the old photo, it would have been like way up there. So the land, it's really been filled in here. And so when Jonathan Carver originally came here in 1766 and 1767, he would have been looking up at this big arch like this as he walked in, and now, as I mentioned, it's right down at our level when we're actually looking at it. So anyway, they installed these doors, these steel doors, in 1977, and then re-excavated them with the formation of Bruce Vento Nature Sanctuary. And just this past summer, the City Parks Department came back for the first time since 1977 and added some additional features here. They re-welded on some steel plates, and they poured concrete on here and over here at one point. And what they're trying to do is stabilize this entrance, because the natural process of erosion had been gnawing its way back into this cliff here, and you can see an area that's wider than usual. That's like fresh breakdown over there. And it happened because you can even see it from here. You have roots that follow down these joints in the sandstone. The roots grow and then expand, and then they break away a sheet of sandstone. And so the whole thing has a tendency to erode back into the cliff somewhat. And they're trying to stall that, to slow that process down. Because the cave has lost a certain amount of length since it was first seen by Jonathan Carver. The first documentation that we get about the length of this cave is in 1857, when McAllister, or excuse me, when McNeil, the president who founded Macalester College, came down here, and he measured the length of Carver's Cave as 117 feet. So now we've got something, we've got something to compare it with. And another person, the antiquarian T.H. Lewis, measured the length of the cave again in 1898, and he found it to be 113 feet long. And the cave now it's just like I seem to recall it's a bit over 90 feet. So it hasn't lost all that much length, but it is getting, in one sense, because of the rapid erosion of the entrance due to during the post-European settlement times and aggressive root development and so on here. The cave is getting a little bit. It has lost some feet, several feet at least, since it was probably several tens of feet actually since it was originally seen by Jonathan Carver.